very interested in the teaching of God and very influential among the friends in the city. She came with a pitcher to draw water from the well at noontime. She met Jesus and had a very deep and interesting conversation with Jesus. Christ told her that if you drink from this water, you will thirst again. But if you drink from the water I will give you, you will never thirst. During the conversation, the Samaritan woman understood what Jesus was saying. She left her pitcher that she brought all the way to the well to draw water and dashed back to the city and brought many to come to listen to Jesus. And Jesus stayed in Sychar for 2 more days, and many believed in Jesus. Tonight, we look at the woman caught in adultery. Also, the Bible did not mention her name, but she was not as talkative as the Samaritan woman. In fact, throughout the whole incident, she said only a few words. Before we look into this event, I want to help you to understand that Jesus had many enemies who tried to trap him and cause him to do all kinds of things that will cause him to be answerable to the Roman authorities. Let's look at another confrontation, this time from Matthew chapter 22, verse 15. The Pharisees went and took counsel how they might entrap Jesus in his talk. Then sent their disciples to him, saying, "Teacher, we know that you are honest and teach the way of God in truth, no matter who you teach, for you are not partial to anyone. Tell us, therefore, what do you think? Is it lawful to pay taxes to Caesar or not?" But Jesus perceived their wickedness and said, "Why do you test me, you hypocrites?" From this other incident where the Pharisees confronted Jesus, let's explore some background from this enmity. Then the Pharisees went and took counsel how they might entrap him in his talk. The Pharisees does not condone what Jesus was doing, and they want to erase Jesus permanently from the landscape. And they finally did with the help of Judas. This happened when Jesus gave Judas permission at the Last Supper in John 13:27. Then Jesus said to Judas, "What you do, do quickly." The point I want to make is that until Jesus gave permission, no matter what the Pharisees try to do, they cannot succeed against Jesus. So, in this other incident, they sent their disciples to him, saying, "Teacher, we know that you are honest, and you teach the way of God in truth, no matter who you teach, for you aren't partial to anyone." Here we learn that when they confront Jesus, they know that Jesus will always play fair. Sometimes when we encounter confrontation with others who try to entrap us, we will become nasty and we'll pull ourselves down to their level and play dirty. But Jesus would not. And his enemies understood this, and so they want to entrap him for his good nature. This is why they want him to give judgment to this woman that commit adultery. Because if we are not like Jesus, we will try to wiggle our way out of it. Like what the book of Proverbs says in 26 and verse 18. Like the man who was discovered for deceiving his neighbor. And they simply laugh it off and says, "I was only joking." Jesus is not this way. So, they ask Jesus, "Tell us therefore, what do you think? Is it lawful to pay taxes to Caesar or not?" But Jesus perceived their wickedness and said, "Why do you test me, you hypocrites?" And so Jesus was aware of their intentions all these times. They were wicked. It was a test, and they were hypocrites. And so now we go to another entrapment. This time in John chapter 8, our lesson 4 to 9. Now, very early in the morning, he came again into the temple, and all the people came to him. He sat down and taught them. The scribes and the Pharisees brought a woman taken in adultery. Having set her in the midst, they told him, "Teacher, we found a woman in adultery in the very act. Now, in our law, Moses commanded us to stone such. What then do you say about her?" They said this, testing him, that they might have something to accuse him of. But Jesus stooped down, wrote on the ground with his finger, and when they continued asking him, he looked up and said to them, "He who is without sin among you, let him throw the first stone at all." Again he stooped down and with his finger wrote on the ground. Again he stooped. They, when they heard it, being convinced by their conscience, went out one by one, beginning from the oldest even to the last. Jesus was left alone with the woman, where she was in the middle. Jesus, standing up, saw her and said, "Woman, where are your accusers? Did no one condemn you?" She said, No one, Lord. Jesus said, neither do I condemn you. Go your way. From now on, sin no more. Another incident in the life of our Lord Jesus. And yet, there is so much that we can glean from this passage. John 8, 2 to 11, we will try to comment on this passage a little bit at a time. First, we see Jesus' routine. Now, very early in the morning, he came again into the temple, and all the people came to him. He sat down and taught them. It was very early in the morning. I guess that it could be about 6 o'clock in the morning. For some people, that's early. For others, it is very early. But 6 o'clock would be a good guess. And notice that Jesus sat. He was not standing up. He was sitting. And as far as the temple is concerned, it belongs to the Pharisees and the priests and the enemies of Christ. And so he was using what we would describe as an away ground rather than neutral premises. He was in the Pharisees' stronghold, held by his enemies. But there was an eager following, and the Pharisees knew where Jesus was. Going back to another incident in the life of Jesus, when his parents found Jesus missing, when Jesus was the age of 12 years old. After one day, plus another 2 days searching for Jesus in Jerusalem, they finally found Jesus in the temple. But the Pharisees have got wise to Jesus' routine and knew that Jesus was in the temple. The scribes and the Pharisees brought a woman taken in adultery. Having set her in the midst, they told him, "Teacher, we found this woman in adultery in the very act." The first time I read this, I was just confused. How do you catch a person in the act of adultery early in the morning? I suppose people would commit adultery later in the day, possibly in the cool of the night. In the morning, you're home, and you're home with your family. And how did this happen? Something fishy. And why was only this woman brought before Jesus? You cannot commit adultery with one person. There must be a partner. And so I guess that this is an inside job involving this man who got away scot-free. Matthew 26 is an example of how low the enemies of Christ will sink in order to erase Jesus from the landscape. And here we have the priest paying Judas 30 pieces of silver to get rid of Jesus. Another time, Matthew chapter 26, verse 59 and following, the enemies of Christ have gone out of their way to find false witnesses so as to accuse Jesus. These people are not praying fair. They are just trying every way to get rid of Jesus. So they bought this woman while Jesus was teaching, sitting down, trusting the woman in the midst of the crowd, and asked, we found this woman in adultery in the very act. And they want Jesus to give his judgment on what to do about her. All the Jews know that the Old Testament in Leviticus chapter 20, verse 10, that the man who commits adultery with another's wife, even he who commits adultery with his neighbor's wife, the adulterer and the adulteress shall surely be put to death. It is a serious offense. Both men and women would be punished. But when you look at the fine print, it looks like the law is very heavy on the woman and not as heavy on the man. But still, both of them will be stoned to death. The reason why they asked Jesus is that they are testing him, that they may use Jesus' judgment to accuse him. The trap is this: if Jesus approved the stoning, then Jesus will be going against the Roman law, because the Jews were not allowed to put anyone to death. But if Jesus do not approve, then Jesus will be seen going against the Jewish teaching. Either way, Jesus will be condemned. But Jesus stood now and wrote on the ground with a finger. I think this is significant because Jesus was sitting, teaching. The Pharisees brought this woman, causing a stir, and Jesus could have stood up and confronted the intrusion. But remember, Jesus was in the temple. Instead of confronting the crowd, Jesus stood down so that he is away from view and that the stage is given to the Pharisees and his crowd. It was on his enemy's home ground. I think most of us would be interested to know what Jesus wrote on the sand at that time. But I believe it was nothing significant. He was just trying to give up his teaching, pause it, stoop on the ground and see what the Pharisees would do. In today's situation, if Jesus is here, he might have taken out a handphone and just tap on it, just ignoring the intrusion. But when they continue asking him, he looked up and said to them, "He who is without sin among you, let him throw the first stone at her." Jesus was stooping on the ground, writing on the sand. And the persistent Pharisees were urging Jesus to give a judgment. He ignored them, but finally he looked up and said these words. It may be the home ground of Jesus' enemies, but Jesus was there earlier than them. And the followers of Jesus were filling up the place, listening to Jesus. And so when Jesus said these words, there were many sincere people in the crowd that took Jesus seriously. And one by one, they left. What the Pharisees hoped to do is to get the crowd excited and stone this woman. But instead, the crowd left the scene because of the insistence of the Pharisees. Jesus responded and then went back with his finger wrote on the ground, letting nature to take its course. And as we all know, the result, they, when they heard it, being convicted by their conscience, went out one by one, beginning with the oldest, even to the last. We all commit sin. We make mistakes. And possibly the older we live, the more mistakes we make. But even the last, the youngest, have committed sins. This was the response of the majority of the crowd who were there, who rose up early to seek Jesus in earnest. At this point, some commentators have suggested that Jesus could have got up and be the last person to leave the scene. But he has damaged goods, a soul with damaged goods to attend to. For Jesus, it was just not the thrill of winning the debate with his enemies. Not just a black and white case of judgment, but Jesus added mercy. What a wonderful response to a watertight question. Jesus was left alone with the woman where she was in the middle. Jesus, standing up, saw her and said to her, "Woman, where are your accusers? Did no one condemn you?" She said, "No one, Lord." This was the first time that Jesus actually stood up the whole morning. Jesus sat, Jesus stood, Jesus looked up, but now, when everybody was gone, Jesus stood up, and Jesus talked to this woman in earnest. We know that Jesus does not condone sin. So Jesus said, neither do I condemn you. Go your way. From now on, sin no more. Evidently, this woman was a pawn in the hands of the man that orchestrated the entire sting. And something tells me that this woman will return home wiser, repentant, having been touched by the compassion of Jesus in this incident at the temple. In summary, I want to say tonight that Jesus had many enemies. He was challenged by the devil himself, by priests, by scribes, and by the Pharisees. And every time Jesus showed compassion and an understanding of the scriptures that he may use against the devil and his enemies. But he never individually condemned anyone, and always turned their hearts back home to God and let the individual decide. Even the rich young ruler who decided to turn his back against Jesus. Tonight, I believe that the church will do well to follow the example of Jesus. Stay on the scriptures, but meet it out with a dose of compassion when we come across incidents, situations like adultery, mistakes, and all kinds of sin, turning their hearts back